Do you guys remember when, I guess it would have been Zack Snyder, was trying out Nicolas Cage for the role of Superman? It was in the long hair, Gone in 60 Seconds era, Nick Cage. I mean, it was when he was really doing the quirky stuff. Well, he's always really done the quirky stuff. But it was when he was thought of as maximum, well, gosh, kind of a lot's happened since then. Quirky, weird. And they put him in the Superman muscle suit and they snapped a few pictures and those got leaked. And I assume they got leaked intentionally to figure out if the audience, who has known Nick Cage for a long time, would accept him in this new role, in this new light. And the answer was a resounding no. And further, what are you thinking? It was a disaster. And so they pivoted a different way. And I think they picked a guy who's worked pretty well for Superman. But there's a reality there that the people behind that cinematic universe understood. And that is that when you get locked in on a place in your brain where you put somebody, it can be very difficult to put that somebody in a different place in your brain. For example, let's say that you knew somebody since they were a little kid and you watched them bumble through school and do life and learn things. And then all of a sudden that same person becomes a regional religious celebrity who's performing miracles and claiming to be the completion of the religion to which you and everyone you've ever met adheres. Understandably, it could be difficult for a person to make that mental pivot. Well, when we think about Jesus in the context of the book of Matthew, we tend to think of it as people who already know the reputation. This guy's a rock star. He's the most famous person in history, and we've seen him portrayed as such a bazillion times over the course of our lives, whether we're religious or not. And we've heard his words framed as scripture, as infinitely wise. And so it's almost impossible for us to picture the kid version of Jesus developing language skills and figuring out how to be coordinated and navigating the things that you navigate as a kid. And we get an indication in the book of Luke that he did some pretty remarkable stuff as a young man and that he was not a normal kid, that he was at least familiar with what his mission was as a kid. And in that little anecdote we get over there in Luke where Jesus bails out from the crowd in Jerusalem and ends up at the temple talking with the bigwigs there and impressing them with his knowledge. Like we figure out, okay, he was exceptional. He was something. He was on mission from the get-go. But at the same time, he was fully God, fully man, which means that all the things that a kid goes through, he went through. And I imagine that Matthew, in particular of the four gospel authors, looked at the reality of who his audience was going to be, looked at the reality of people he'd collected taxes from. I was like, you know what? There are a lot of people who just straight up know Jesus and his family and his brothers and sisters, and they knew his dad and they know his mom. And I've got some pretty negative feedback from them on Jesus. I've got some pretty positive feedback from other people who knew him growing up. There's a very mixed reception here. And so one back of the mind question that the original audience, and I suppose the right now audience, would ask as they encounter the story of Jesus doing all of this stuff and garnering all this attention and all the friction around him, one of the questions that would be asked is, what did the people who knew him the whole time think? Did they see this coming? Or were they like, wow, he was such a normal boy. Who could have possibly seen that coming? Who could have known that he was going to do those things? You know, he was always nicer than the other kids, but he fed 5,000 people for free, miraculously. Nobody could have anticipated that. Well, Luke and Mark give us a little bit of insight into that, but Matthew seems the most interested in how Jesus was received by the people who'd known him before he got big. And so we get the little anecdote that we looked at yesterday at the end of chapter 12, where Jesus' mother and his brothers are standing outside, not listening to Jesus' speech. And they send somebody in to be like, yeah, bring Jesus out here. I mean, it looks like they came to retrieve him, to save him from himself, to do some kind of intervention here. And just in case you're looking at that and you're like, no. Mary doesn't make mistakes. She is the best person of all the persons ever. Surely she recognized Jesus for what he was. I mean, the first miracle was at Mary's behest to the servants at the wedding at Cana. She was like, hey, do whatever he says. I mean, she trusted in him. She sang the Magnificat, which demonstrates a robust, complete understanding of the redemptive work of God through time and where she fits and where Jesus fits. I mean, she's the one who said, "May it be to me as you have said," and demonstrated enormous faith when probably almost nobody else would have done that. Yeah, all of that is super true. And you're right, Mary is awesome. Maybe the best fully human, fallible character in the Bible. I would say she rivals John the Baptist for being the second most important character in the New Testament. But whether you go with Mary or you go with John, they're both people who from the very beginning of Jesus' life were connected intimately with what he was going to accomplish and what he was going to do, and they got it right, and they lived their lives in ways that demonstrated that they understood who Jesus was. But also, you flip back over here to the beginning of Matthew chapter 11, and John the Baptist is like, I know we got a lot of miles together, and I know we're family, and I know I've vouched for you in front of everybody, but are you the one? It's not that weird that in the very next chapter, the other person who is positioned as well as John to know who Jesus is and to have had his back also seems to wobble a little bit. And that is in keeping with what we see at the end of chapter 13 in the following passage. Starting in verse 53, this is the first thing that happens after we conclude the kingdom parables discourse. It says, when Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers? They asked. Isn't this a carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, only in his hometown and in his own house is a prophet without honor. And he didn't do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. So it's not tough to tell what's going on narratively here. Jesus talked in a bay for the first half of 13 on a boat. Second half of 13, he's in Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, inside with his disciples. He gets done with the, you guys understand this? And they're like, yes, exchange. And then he goes straight from there and moves on from Capernaum and says coming to his hometown. Well, we know his hometown is Nazareth. It's maybe an hour drive at this point, maybe a little bit more. I've only been there a couple of times, but one of the times I went there was to take my family to see Avengers Infinity War. That was crazy. Did you know that they still have intermissions at the movies in Israel? Or at least that one did. It was so weird, so high stakes. All of a sudden, it's like, hey, this is a little dancing popcorn guy. Go and take your break and get yourself a soda. Except in Hebrew, it was a very different experience. A good movie, memorable place to see it. Everybody was crying at the end. But back in the day, it would have been longer than an hour. I mean, you're walking. So, I mean, this is a few days journey probably from Capernaum to Nazareth. However far it was, he makes his way back to Nazareth, and this is where everybody knows him, and he gets there, and people start to make the connections. We know from multiple gospel sources that people in Nazareth were aware of what was going on, and like I just mentioned, his family had made the trip from Nazareth to Capernaum to try and retrieve him from embarrassing himself. But why would they do that? Well, given how the family behaved when they came to Capernaum, it looks like they were probably under a lot of social pressure in Nazareth. Since the last time Jesus was there, he's blown up, he's really popular, he's become a lightning rod, people think different things, it's divisive, and Mary, at this point, it looks like Joseph has passed away, she's on her own, she's got these adult children. This is a difficult thing. Maybe it was affecting their lives negatively, and they wanted to go and try to do something about it. Now, Matthew gives us a chronological cue between the end of chapter 12, where Jesus' family shows up to retrieve him, and the beginning of chapter 13, where we get into the kingdom parables discourse. It says that same day. So immediately after Jesus says, you all are my mothers and brothers and sisters if you do the will of my Father who's in heaven, that same day, he goes out on the boat and gives the kingdom parables discourse. Then he goes back into the house and talks privately with his people. There's no record in there of him at any point actually engaging with his family, but I have to think he did. And I have to think it's not a coincidence that then the end of chapter 13 has him going back to Nazareth. Probably he hiked with his family. That would be my guess. They wanted to retrieve him, so he has been retrieved. He's just doing it on his own terms. Maybe they wanted to take him back to Nazareth to be like, look, this is how people are responding to you. This is how it's going. And while all of that is speculative, what isn't speculative is that when he gets there, everybody's like, wow, that is very, very impressive. Yeah, but I've known you for a long time. I just must be mistaken about how impressive that is. You see a deterioration as the passage goes along. From this was awesome, to, wait, who is that guy? To, I'm offended by this. So in the same way that some astute producer figured out that audiences who'd become accustomed to Nicolas Cage being one kind of thing and playing one kind of role, that those audiences probably wouldn't accept him in this other more heroic role. So it looks like the people of Nazareth had locked in Jesus on this one kind of role, and they weren't really up for accepting him in this other role. We'll break down that rejection and what it means for where the story goes next tomorrow. In the meantime, I want to remind you of our contest from now up to episode 400. If you have been paying attention to the little musical pastiches and homages at the end of these episodes, and you've been making mental notes like, I think that one means this, and I think that one means this, all you got to do is put together an email around the time that episode 400 comes out, giving me your take on how those things connect, and whoever gets the most things right is going to get an awesome prize. And I have determined that it is going to be a prize that you totally want. Thanks for hanging out with me. I always have fun with it. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.